Hello, it's time for your next English lesson. Let's find out what's been happening with Charlie. So we're up to chapter 9. Grandpa Joe takes a gamble. We're going to be recording the plot points again. So I want you to send me pictures of your notes. You can use mine as a template, or you can take notes in your own way, and you can get as creative as you like and put some little pictures on there. Just whatever helps you to kind of get under the skin of the story, really. So here we go, chapter 9. Grandpa Joe takes a gamble. The next day, when Charlie comes home from school and goes to see his grandparents, he found only Grandpa Joe was awake. The other three were all snoring loudly. "Shh," whispered Grandpa Joe, and he beckoned Charlie to come closer. Charlie tiptoed over and stood beside the bed. The old man gave Charlie a sly grin, and then he started rummaging under the pillow with one hand. And when the hand came out again, there was an ancient leather purse clutched in the fingers. Under the cover of the bedclothes, the old man opened the purse and tipped it upside down. Out fell a single silver sixpence. "It's my secret hoard," he whispered. "The others don't know I've got it. And now you and I are going to have one more fling at finding the last ticket. How about it, eh? But you'll have to help me." "Are you sure you want to spend your money on that, Grandpa?" Charlie whispered. "Of course I'm sure," spluttered the old man excitedly. "Don't stand there arguing. I'm as keen as you are to find that ticket. Here, take the money and run down the street to the nearest shop and buy the first Wonka bar you see and bring it straight back to me and we'll open it together." Charlie took out the little silver coin and slipped quickly out of the room. In 5 minutes he was back. "Have you got it?" whispered Grandpa Joe, his eyes shining with excitement. Charlie nodded and held out the bar of chocolate. "Wonka's Nutty Crunch Surprise," it said on the wrapper. "Good," the old man whispered, sitting up in bed and rubbing his hands. "Now come over here and sit close to me and we'll open it together. Are you ready?" "Yes," Charlie said, "I'm ready." "All right, you tear off the first bit." "No," Charlie said, "you paid for it. You do it all." The old man's fingers were trembling most terribly as they fumbled with the wrapper. "We don't have a hope, really," he whispered, giggling a bit. "You do know we don't have a hope, don't you?" "Yes," Charlie said, "I know that." They looked at each other and both started giggling nervously. "Mind you," said Grandpa Joe, "there is just a tiny chance that it might be the one. Don't you agree?" "Yes," Charlie said, "of course. Why don't you open it, Grandpa?" "All in good time, my boy, all in good time. Which end do you think I should open first?" "That corner, the one furthest from you. Just tear off a tiny bit, but not quite enough for us to see anything." "Like that," said the old man. "Yes, now just a little bit more." "You finish it," said Grandpa Joe. "I'm too nervous." "No, Grandpa, you must do it yourself." "Very well then, here it goes." He tore off the wrapper. They both stared at what lay underneath. It was a bar of chocolate and nothing more. All at once they both saw the funny side of the whole thing, and they burst into peals of laughter. "What on earth's going on?" cried Grandma Josephine, waking up suddenly. "Nothing," said Grandpa Joe. "You go back to sleep." Right, so that's the end of chapter 9. So what's happened in the plot there then, do you think? Well, basically, the main thing, oh, you can't see that. The main thing that's happened in chapter 9 is that Charlie and Grandpa Joe open another bar of chocolate. But there's no ticket. Okay, so on to chapter 10 next. Here we go. We're really getting to grips with this story now. Chapter 10. The family begins to starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw huge flakes drifting slowly down out of an icy sky that was the colour of steel. Brilliant description. By evening, it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house. Wow, that's nearly as tall as some of you. By evening, it lay 4 deep, sorry I've read this bit, around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping, and oh, how bitterly cold it was. Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice, and each time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Another great description there. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing in through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich, steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious warming dishes. And because we are all a great deal luckier than we realise, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because the family couldn't afford it, and as the cold weather went on and on, he became both ravenously and desperately hungry. Both bars of chocolate, the birthday one and the one that Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away. And all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then all at once the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was the toothpaste factory, the place where Mr. Bucket worked, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets. But it wasn't even enough to buy a quarter of the food that 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was half a boiled potato. Surely and slowly, everybody in the house began to starve, and every day, little Charlie Bucket, there he is, look, he's tiny, and that's the gates to the factory, which are huge. Little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would have to pass Mr. Wonka's giant chocolate factory, and every day he came near to it, he'd lift his small pointed nose high in the air and sniff the wonderful smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he'd stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on end, taking deep, swallowing breaths as though he was trying to eat the smell itself. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under a blanket one icy morning, "that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us, we're too old to bother with. But a growing boy, he can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton." "What can one do?" murmured Grandma Josephine miserably. "He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate this morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back." "He's a fine little fellow," said Grandpa George. "He deserves better than this." The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. The skin was drawn so tightly over the cheeks that you could see the shapes of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with that curious wisdom that often seems to come from small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did, so to save his strength. In the morning, he left the house 10 minutes earlier so that he could walk slowly to school without ever having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during break, resting himself while the others rushed outside and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then one afternoon, walking back home with the icy wind in his face and incidentally feeling hungrier than he had ever felt before, his eye was caught suddenly by something silvery lying in the gutter. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw what it was at once. It was a 50p piece. Quickly, he looked around him. Had somebody dropped it? No, that was impossible because of the way part of it was buried. Several people went hurrying past him on the pavement, their chins sunk deep in the collars of their coats, their feet crunching in the snow. None of them was searching for money. None of them was taking the slightest bit of notice of the small boy crouching in the gutter. Then, was it his? This 50p? Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole 50p. He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him at that moment, and only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving towards the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery shop, the kind that sells almost everything, including sweets and cigars. And what would he do? He whispered quickly to himself. He would buy one luscious bar of chocolate and eat it all up, every bit of it, right then and there, and the rest of the money he would take straight back home and give to his mother. Right, so that's the end of chapter 10. What's been happening in chapter 10? Well, first of all, the family is starving. Second of all, Mr. Bucket has lost his job. These pens aren't very good. Thirdly, Charlie finds 50p. Anything else we can say about that? Oh, and we can also say snow. It starts to snow, doesn't it? It gets very cold. Right, so on to chapter 11 next. Right. Let me move that back. You can't see the bottom, can you? Shall I move this back? There we go. That's a bit better, isn't it? Right, chapter 11, which is called The Miracle. Charlie entered the shop and laid the damp 50p piece on the counter. One Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mellow Delight, he said, remembering how much he'd loved the one he'd had on his birthday. The man behind the counter looked fat and well-fed. He had big lips and fat cheeks and a very fat neck. The fat around his neck bulged out all around the top of his collar like a rubber ring. He turned and reached behind him for the chocolate bar, and then he turned back again and handed it to Charlie. Charlie grabbed it and quickly tore off the wrapper and took an enormous bite. And then he took another and another, and oh, the joy of being able to cram large pieces of something sweet and solid into one's mouth. The sheer, blissful joy of being able to fill one's mouth with rich, solid food. You look like you wanted that one, Sonny, the shopkeeper said pleasantly. Charlie nodded, his mouth bulging with chocolate. The shopkeeper put Charlie's change on the counter. Take it easy, he said. It'll give you a tummy ache if you swallow it like that without chewing. Charlie went on wolfing the chocolate. He couldn't stop, and in less than half a minute, the whole thing had disappeared down his throat. He was quite out of breath, but he felt marvellously, extraordinarily happy. He reached out a hand to take the change, and then he paused. His eyes were just above the level of the counter. They were staring at the silver coins lying there. The coins were all 5-penny pieces. There were 9 of them altogether. Surely it wouldn't matter if he spent just one more. I think, he said quietly, I think I'll have just one more of those chocolate bars. The same kind as before, please. Why not? Said the fat shopkeeper, reaching behind him again and taking another whipple scrumptious fudge mallow delight from the shelf. He laid it on the counter. Charlie picked it up and tore off the wrapper, and suddenly, from underneath the wrapper, there came a brilliant flash of gold. Charlie's heart stood still. It's a golden ticket! Screamed the shopkeeper, leaping about a foot in the air. You've got a golden ticket! You've found the last golden ticket! Hey, would you believe it? Come and look at this, everybody. This kid's found Wonka's last golden ticket. There it is. It's right there in his hands. It seemed as though the shopkeeper might be going to have a fit. In my shop too, he yelled. He found it right here in my own little shop. Somebody call the newspapers quick and let them know. Watch out now, Sonny. Don't tear it as you unwrap it. That thing's precious. In a few seconds, there was a crowd of about 20 people clustering round Charlie, and many more were pushing their way in from the street. Everybody wanted to get a look at the golden ticket and the lucky finder. Where is it? Somebody shouted. Hold it up so all of us can see it. There it is, there, somebody else shouted. He's holding it in his hands. See that gold shining? How did he manage to find it? I'd like to know, a large boy shouted angrily. 20 bars a day I've been buying for weeks and weeks. Think of all the free stuff he'll be getting too, another boy said enviously. A lifetime supply. He'll need it, the skinny little shrimp, a girl said, laughing. Charlie hadn't moved. He hadn't even unwrapped the golden ticket from around the chocolate. He was standing very still, holding it tightly with both hands, while the crowd pushed and shouted all around him. He felt quite dizzy. There was a peculiar floating sensation coming over him, as though he were floating up in the air like a balloon. His feet didn't seem to be touching the ground at all. He could hear his heart thumping away loudly somewhere in his throat. At that point, he became aware of a hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and when he looked up, he saw a tall man standing over him. Listen, the man whispered. I'll buy it from you. I'll give you £50. How about it, eh? And I'll give you a new bicycle as well, okay? Are you crazy? Shouted a woman who was standing equally close. Why, I'd give him £200 for that ticket. You want to sell that ticket for £200, young man? That's quite enough of that, the fat shopkeeper shouted, pushing his way through the crowd and taking Charlie firmly by the arm. Leave the kid alone, will you? Make way there. Let him out. And to Charlie, as he held open the door, he whispered, Don't you let anybody have it. Take it straight home quickly before you lose it. Run all the way and don't stop till you get there. Understand? Charlie nodded. You know something, the fat shopkeeper said, pausing a moment and smiling at Charlie. I have a feeling you needed a break like this. I'm awfully glad you got it. Good luck to you, Sonny. Thank you, Charlie said, and off he went, running through the snow as fast as his legs would go. And as he flew past Mr. Willy Wonka's factory, he turned and waved at it and sang out, I'll be seeing you! I'll be seeing you soon! And 5 minutes later, he arrived at his own home. Woo! He's got one! Right, so chapter 11. Charlie finds 50p and buys a bar chocolate. He gets 9 times 5 pence change. How much is that, my little times table superstars? 9 times 5. And spends 5p on another bar. He gets a golden ticket! No way! And runs home. Right. That's where we're going to leave it for today. Tomorrow, your English lesson is going to be, it's not going to be like this. You're going to be doing some artwork really tomorrow and getting creative and designing your own chocolate bar. So what I'd like you to do, if you can, if it's okay with mum and dad or whoever's at home looking after you at the moment, I want you to, for tomorrow's English lesson, collect together as many bars of chocolate and sweeties and treats as you can. Okay, and I want you to put them in a bowl and I want you to have those ready for tomorrow's English lesson. Okay, take care. See you then.